So I wanted to go through the top 10 books that I've read this year. And I've read, oh my goodness, it feels like I've been studying more than I was in, when I was finishing up my master's degree, just the amount of material that I've been going over. So it's been a really fruitful year. Um, One significant thing, or the most significant thing about the books I have in front of me is, after converting and being received into Orthodoxy last year, I kind of felt the urgency with which I was studying theology and church history. Um, you know, that urgency dissipated. I came to a conclusion and I acted on it, and it was sort of settled. In the future, I'm sure I'll return to theology and liturgical studies. But for now, I think I took a much needed break after being in that world of scholarship for the better part of a decade with two degrees and seminary work. So kind of took a break on that, but I got to read and explore things that I just really haven't had a chance because they didn't fit into my theology degrees. So stuff that I've been meaning to look into, I was finally able to delve into this year, which was really great. A lot of these books actually started last year, but because of the conversion and because of our move, I didn't finish until we got settled out here in our new beautiful more rural location. So one of the areas that I've been really looking into is actually political philosophy, and I think the whole turmoil of 2020 and just everything that has been transpiring really made me rethink some of my just unconscious perceptions of how politics works and how the state is set up. I just questioned everything, and that really meant getting back into political philosophy and starting where I would start, which is in the classical tradition. So reading Aristotle, reading the Politics. Even though Aristotle is not on this list, I think he spurred a lot of the reading that I have been doing. So Aristotle is pretty interesting, and when you study Aristotle as a Christian, you're really looking primarily at his metaphysics or his ethics. But for Aristotle, even ethics is just a preamble to politics. He really does see politics as the supreme branch of philosophy. All of his philosophy is oriented towards politics, and it's because for Aristotle, politics isn't primarily about which system of government should we have. That's sort of a secondary question for him. Man is a social animal, and he can't really fully realize himself and realize his good outside of society. He needs society to kind of be fully human. So the question of how best to live with other humans for Aristotle is the premier is the most important question you can ask. So his political philosophy is very interesting in that way. Aristotle does do a lot of comparative evaluations of different styles of government, monarchy, democracy, tyranny, things like that. But really, I think what he basically comes to, what later philosophers would call, the iron law of oligarchy. That as soon as you get a group of people, larger than 20, you're going to get a small group of highly invested people who can really communicate their ideas that basically make the decisions. So you always get oligarchies. It's sort of an anthropological law. You can't really get around it. So in Aristotle's assessment, something like democracy really doesn't exist. It's a farce. You never actually get ruled by the people. You get ruled by a small group. So for Aristotle, the question is, how do you keep that small group good? If it's going to be an oligarchy, no matter what, whether it has a king leading it or elected officials or what have you, how do you keep that small group of people to be ethical, to be really the virtuous? And that's what an aristocracy is. It's the rule of the virtuous, those who exhibit arete or virtue in the Hellenic sense. So Aristotle, I would say, kind of looks at two different models, group rule and individual rule, and sees, one is ideal and one is a degenerate version of. So on one side, he has an aristocracy, a group of good humans, and on the other side, he has different forms of oligarchy where the people are not good, that they're not ruling in the best interests of the people, or where, maybe to put it differently, where their best and highest good is coordinated with the social good. And also, monarchy versus tyranny. Tyranny is just a degenerate form of monarchy where the monarch's good and the people's good are not aligned. But all of that really got me to delve deeply into actually sociology. Man is a social animal. What does that really mean? So the first book that I really dove into, I actually read this before, but I gave it a reread, and I found it to be very enlightening, was Peter Berger's The Social Construct of Reality. Now, this is actually a really important book. So Berger, he was in, or at least influenced by, the whole Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School people came to the United States, but he kind of was part of that whole thinking, that whole, what we would call, the cultural shift in Marxism, where the Marxist thinkers started not focusing on economic relationships and exploitation, but really focusing on culture. And Berger is certainly in that camp. Now, he swears all throughout the book that he's not a Marxist, but I think it's actually very clear that he is a Marxist. So I do have a lot of problems with the book, but I think he develops a certain line of Marxist thinking that comes from Marx himself, but also I always forget his name, the Russian Marxist thinker, not Lukács, Vygotsky. I read one of his books. I can't remember, but he was a Marxist, really a social psychologist. His work is very similar to Piaget, where he really delves in how our consciousness is basically constructed in childhood. But Berger takes all of that and creates like a general theory of social construct. This is how your worldview basically is created by your society. And he has a concept of concretization, which I think is really a really important idea. The most central idea is obviously the social construct of reality. And I say that, and I realize how that's used in our culture and by contemporary postmodernists and Marxists, but I really think it's really, they're misusing that idea. And people who don't like the idea of the social construct of reality, they misrepresent the idea. So I want to dispel what Berger is not saying. What he's not saying is that reality is just the things that we all agree on. There is no objective reality out there. It's just what's in my head, what's in your head, what I'm socially programmed into. That's what's real. That's not quite what Berger's saying. What he's saying is that social realities are just as real as trees and mountains and deserts and streams. That as a social animal, the social environment that we inhabit is just as real as anything else. And I think that's a very powerful argument. So he talks about things, and this is sort of where the Marxism comes in, like money. Money exists. Does it exist just because we all agree that we need, a method of locating value and quantifying it and a means of exchange? Well, yeah, but because we all agree that it exists, it really does exist. It's part of our reality just as much as a tree or anything else. But what he's also saying, and he uses the example of a plow. He actually uses this example in another book as well, that the plow, the farming implement, it's a reality, but it also creates a reality, creates a social reality, it creates a way of being human that simply can't be ignored. Like if you can plow a field and you can do large scale agriculture, you really change the society and you change the human animal. So it has this whole implicit logic to it, an implicit reality that forms culture and then forms human beings that sort of are generated out of that culture. So lots of very interesting ways in how our reality, our social reality is constructed. So when he's talking about the social construct of reality, he's not saying everything is subjective. That's not at all what he says. What he's saying is our social technologies are real parts of the human environment. So that aspect I think is just really good. Again, he's developing that from Marx and early Marxist thought, but he's really bringing a very complete theory to how that works, and I think it's very, very worth reading. But I do have very strong critiques of Berger, and part of my critique, or actually my central critique, is that he doesn't know or he doesn't account for where these social realities come from. He gives really stupid examples of how he thinks it happens. So what he thinks is basically, a few people get together and they get into a habit of interacting with each other, and then that habit is concretized and becomes the structures of social reality as it's passed through generations. But for him, it's all just happenstance. It's just because it just happens this way. And I think that's very silly. Like he gives an example of a society that a heterosexual male and a heterosexual female and one child start interacting in a certain way, and that creates what maybe we would call like cis heteronormativity or something like that. But it could have just as easily been a different way. Like let's say there were three lesbians, they would have created a completely different culture and social reality. So I think that's sort of just because, or reality is this way just because the founding sort of had a certain dynamic or a power dynamic that was sort of locked in at the beginning. I don't find that compelling at all. Now, there is such a thing as the founder effect, which some of the other books I read this year get into, that the context in which a culture sort of is born out of, its ecology, its life ways, its language, that can have ripple effects for millennia. But it's not just because. There's always reasons why society happens, why certain relationships come about in the way that they do, and then get concretized. So Berger won't accept any of that. He actually says in a footnote, like he rejects, upfront that way of thinking, which I think is really is a major blinder. But the reason why he objects to that is because if you say there's a reason why these social dynamics are structured in a certain way in the first place, then you can't change them. He wants to keep the option, sort of this Marxist, fluidity of culture always in play. So if you put any restraints, particularly biological restraints on anything, that will completely mess up the Marxist plan. So read Berger, but I would say you need to read him also reading a very different style of thought that sees some of the same mechanisms as social construct theory does, but roots them in a very different place, or actually gives an account for why these social relationships are constructed in the way they are. So the second book that I really, really, really liked was Steve Williams' The Ape That Understood the Universe. Now, this is also about the subjective construction of reality or worldview, but it's not a just because book. It's an evolutionary psychology book. And I just wanted to make a note because I've talked about this at least on social media and in person before. As an Orthodox Christian, you don't actually have to buy the theory of evolution to get a lot out of these evolutionary psychology material. We just have to face that evolutionary theory is the predominant prevailing theory of the sciences today. So anyone seriously talking about human beings and how we are is going to have to engage in some way with evolution. You really can't get around that until a new theory supplants it, which it likely will. But the good news is that evolution keeps changing so much. Like I remember when I was learning about human evolution, it was right when they discovered this cave, like Homo naledi is what they wound up calling it, and how it completely rewrote everything we know. And it's just like, yeah, I don't have the mental flexibility anymore to like completely relearn all the different Homo subspecies and all this other stuff. So what you find really quickly when you start engaging in these very, very interesting evolutionary psychology material is they don't actually talk a lot about the theory of evolution. They don't really go deep into an account of why our psychology is set up the way it is, because the theory is always changing. So they have to give lip service to it, but really it's just a descriptive anthropology that kind of sprinkles in sort of mythologies or stories of why this is the case. But the real meat of it is just saying this is the case. So I as an Orthodox Christian, you shouldn't be afraid of it, because our current theory of evolution is going to be displaced at some point anyway. And these guys know that. They understand science in a sophisticated enough way that they know it's a tool that's always changing, that you can't really build a foundation on science because it's a moving target, which is something pop culture doesn't get, but actual scientists understand that very well. So don't be afraid of this material. So remember that analogy or that situation that Berger came up with was, oh, society is just this way just because, and he doesn't say this because this is, much later, but people who use social construct theory today, they talk about it in the context of like heteronormativity and patriarchy, and how that's all just complete arbitrary. It was built on power dynamics a million years ago, and we just need to reconstruct culture. The real counter to that is really what you're going to get out of this book in particular. So it's like chapter after chapter after chapter of going through the real biological and psychological differences, and I'll come back to that distinction, but the real differences between men and women, why our bodies are different and why they're different because they do different things, and how our cultures kind of spring out of those biological differences. So it's not just because that society is structured in the way it is. It's because of what the anthropologists will call biological or physiological dimorphism, that men and women were built differently to do different things. So the reason why men lead, and Berger couldn't figure out why, is because they're stronger, because they're built to defend and protect. And the reason why women take the roles that they do is because they're not built for that, because they're always caring for children. So it's not just, we don't know why. Well, we know exactly why. So this book really dispels that. And the funniest part is he basically arrives at the idea that what we would call like traditional Christian marriage or Christian sexual ethics is really the best possible way to be a human, but he can't say that. So he goes page after page of saying that, and then trying to talk his way out of not actually saying that. It's just a wonderful, really a wonderful read, but it really answers a lot of the questions that social construct theory pretends not to know the answers to. So you have to read, I would say, the two together. The next book that I would draw your attention to is Mark Pagel's Wired for Culture, The Origins of the Human Social Mind. So social psychology, but also social sociology. But this book actually covers a lot of the same ground as The Ape That Understood the Universe. But what I like about this book in particular is that, the social construct folk or the Marxist folk or even certain brands of psychology would like to, have you believe, or like you to be involved in this whole debate between nature and nurture. What is everything instinct rooted in biology, or is everything culture? And what this book really, I think, demonstrates, really well is that is a completely ridiculous dichotomy. It just doesn't exist. Man is a cultural animal. Culture is natural to man. We are not born with the equipment that we need to actually navigate our environment. Or maybe to put it better, man is not suited to any particular environment. We have a social environment that equips us with culture, which is a kind of technology, a social technology that helps us navigate the world. So we have biology, but that biology for man flows right into culture. Culture is not something different, it's not something separate. So he draws a lot on, actually Richard Dawkins, about the idea of the gene and then the meme and how they kind of function the same way, where we have a genetic inheritance and a mimetic inheritance. So really important book, but it dispels, I think, once and for all this culture versus nature distinction, showing that it's really just an organic continuity, and it's our weapon, I would say, against the people who would take social construct theory or areas of postmodern thought and try to turn them against reality, turn them against biology. That's not how this works. You can't fight against nature. So fantastic book, highly recommended. Again, you don't have to buy the evolution. They don't really talk, maybe the first chapter kind of gives you an overview of Darwinian evolution, but they always end with, most of the stuff is not how we think about it anymore. And then it goes into the real meat of a descriptive anthropology that is rooted in actual physical, objective reality, how that objective reality or the constraints and affordances of objective reality dictate our subjective. So it's really important to correct it. The next book, I don't actually have the book because I rented it from the library, but it kind of takes all of those ideas and shoves it into one, a really important, highly recommended. I devoured that book, and that's The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, or Haidt. His name might be pronounced Haidt. And that was just a fascinating read. So the first half, what he goes into is just the different ways people construct their moralities, their ethics. And going back to Aristotle, how ethics is a preamble to political philosophy, Haidt basically shows or demonstrates that as a social scientist, as a psychologist, and saying, no, that's actually true. Like we can, we can put numbers to it. We can put studies to it. In the age of scientism, you have to put numbers and studies to things. But he really does bring the receipts, which is really fantastic. Lots of very interesting studies throughout that book. But he talks about the different moral foundations, and then if you're lacking in sort of a balanced moral framework, that you'll arrive at certain political philosophies that are unbalanced. And just to give you some background, Haidt was sort of your normal liberal who was not expecting to find what he found. It actually shocked him, and he didn't quite like the findings. And that is that people who gravitate towards liberal politics usually only have two legs on their moral foundation. I believe the two, if I'm remembering right, were harm avoidance and I want to say fairness, or it might have been equity or something like that. I can't remember. And that people who gravitate towards a more conservative politics usually have all five moral foundations in equal measure. So they have other things like purity, like boundaries, like fairness rather than equity. I think he distinguishes between the two. And that was not what he was wanting to find. It kind of like shattered his whole worldview. But that's just part one of the book, and I actually skimmed through that because I've heard many lectures by Jonathan Haidt where he kind of goes over that. So that wasn't the real interesting part I was looking at. I was looking at part two, where it's more about the neuroscience and how he's basically doing sociology or social psychology, but as a brain scientist. And I found that fascinating. So he gives a lot of like the hard data to what is in those other books that I pointed out, and he kind of just brings it all together into one really concise study, which I thought was really nice. The only thing that I didn't like about the book is basically he goes on chapter after chapter explaining like how, without sort of an overarching transcendent, almost like metaphysical, and he actually goes into like religion, without religion bringing people together on a deeper level, that you can't really have a political unity. It's very interesting. Like he basically comes to the same conclusions that, like Carl Schmitt, like all politics is theological at the end of the day. He basically echoes that and says, no, to actually have a functioning polis, an actual political unity, you have to have the same moral foundations, and the only way to do that is with religion. But he's like an atheist liberal. So the end of the book is like, well, that's never going to happen. So we just need to try liberalism again. Like we just need to do it harder. So I thought the conclusion of the book was a real anticlimactic sort of thing. It was very similar to the evolutionary psychologists, where they're arriving at Christian truths, but they can't admit it. So where do you go from there? It's very similar with Jonathan Haidt, but I definitely recommend. So the next book I have takes all of this and brings it really to a much deeper level, and that is finally Oswald Spengler. This blew me away. So it's actually 2 volumes. Volume 2 I got from the library, so I actually read it first, just because I had to return it, and they're not tightly connected, so you can actually read it that way. And there's actually abridged versions of Spengler, but Spengler is just fantastic. He's just fantastic. So it's hard to define what his thought is. I would actually look at it more like cultural anthropology, but he is a historian in the sense that he's a theoretician of history. So to kind of bring together a lot of these ideas, what he sees history as is the emergence, growth, pinnacle, and then decline of civilizations that he sees more as organisms. Like they have a DNA, and they come in and out of existence. And what they leave behind in their art, architecture, their thought, philosophy, religion, is really the world as they see it, their life world. And he's a secular historian, so he sees history going through cycles, the birth, death cycle. And that's mostly why he's known, for that secular understanding of history. But what I found more valuable than that is actually his methodology and his theoretical foundation. So he's writing, gosh, I think this was written in the 30s, maybe the 20s. Let me see if I can find it real quick, actually. No, I can't find it. He was right before, in Germany, before the National Socialists took over. And they didn't like him because he was too traditional. I think he supported the monarchy, not the republic, but the monarchy. But anyway, Spengler anticipates a lot of what happened in cultural anthropology and social psychology later. So it's a really fascinating read, but it's very deep. He's doing a lot of the same, covering a lot of the same ground as Heidegger, I think, and actually Husserl. So he's doing like a phenomenology of anthropology, or phenomenology of culture is how we put it. So I found myself, whilst reading Spengler and understanding his theory, I had to dip back into Husserl and Heidegger. Like I consulted them a lot because he gets really, you know, he focuses a lot on just how time and space are conceptualized. So it gets in a lot into you know, being in time and just the how phenomenological sort of methodology of bracketing out what you think you know, and just taking sort of the raw experience, you know, and constructing a theory from that. That's basically what Spengler does. Is like forget everything you think you know about Hellenic culture or whatever culture, and just sort of inhabit their life world, and then start to construct their worldview out of that. So it's really fantastic. I can't recommend Oswald Spengler more highly. So that was great. Another book that actually just blew me away. I was not prepared for how much I actually liked this book, and that is David Anthony's The Horse, the Wheel, and Language. So everything that I just talked about with Spengler, this theoretical sort of phenomenology of a culture, Anthony basically does it for Indo-European culture, isolating via language and archaeology and comparative mythology, basically narrowing down where Indo-European culture emerged, the context in which it emerged, and how, and tracing its course through history, where it became, you know, basically the founding genus really of the West. The West, you know, all the way back in my first year of Western Civ, I remember, you know, my professor said the West it's Homer and the Bible. It's the Iliad and the Book of Psalms. And I was like, what did he mean by that? And basically what he was saying is it's this Indo-European expression that sort of peaked really with Hellenic civilization, and then Roman civilization sort of integrates into that in very complicated ways. And then it's a Semitic element, you know, the Middle East and the scriptures. And I've spent so many years studying that aspect, you know, in my master's degrees in theology, but it's particularly in biblical theology. So it's really understanding the life world of Scripture. What is it? What is the story? What is the story saying? What is it saying about our relationship with God, or our relationship with God as a story? So I understood that aspect, or at least have tried to understand that sort of stream of Western civilization. But you know, even reading Plato and Aristotle don't really give you, I think, the heart of the West, because you need to go deeper than that. You need to understand the civilization that they inhabited. And this goes all the way to the very root, you know, and it's just fantastic. Like it's hard to explain, but what he does so well is just weave together what you would think are just different disciplines, and he really does like a Spenglerian sort of phenomenology, where he does this perfect sort of cultural anthropology, where he brings in archaeology, linguistics, mythology, language, and just melds it all together, and you really feel like you understand the root of the West. You know, if you're an English speaker, you're a participant in this reality. You know, even if genetically you're not. You know, my genetics are in Europe, in North Africa. So, you know, this is the root of my, you know, my people, but it's also the root of my culture. And to bring it back to Spengler, maybe, you know, this is the beginning end, and we're living kind of through the tail end, the decline, which is what Spengler is arguing about, or arguing for, rather. So another book that is right up there, and I would actually read these two together, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, and this, the classic, The Ancient City. Can't pronounce his name. by Fustel de Coulanges, the famous French scholar of the classics. This book is just fantastic. So if you think you understand classical civilization and the Greeks, oh, you know the Greeks, you know the Romans, you don't. You need to read this book, because the Greeks, as we know them, in sort of the high point of Hellenic civilization, where you get Thucydides and Pericles, and Athens and Sparta fighting, and then Plato and Aristotle. All of that is actually the tail end of Hellenic civilization. The real body of it is in that space between, really between Homer and Thucydides, I would say. Like Hesiod's right in the middle. So you need to understand that. And that's what de Coulanges really does. He dives deep into how that society was constructed, the central role played by religion, the central role played by oikos, by a domestic economy, and how that predates sort of polis, or what we think of the city-state, that the city-state is sort of an extension of the or a confederation of families. So he develops an idea that for just because he doesn't give a word for it, so I give a word for it, like a superstructural, or basically that you're taking these sort of family structures that each have their own individual cult, they each have their own paterfamilias, but when you get more than one family, you have to integrate them into a tribe. So you get sort of the head tribe and the different branches of that tribe, and then you get an overarching or supersessional cult where they decide on, we have a divine founder of Hercules. It's not just our family, or Laras or daimons that we're sort of venerating when we all come together in a feast. We, venerate this divine founder, and then you scale that up to eventually get to the polis that has a patron deity and a king, but it's a king sort of first among equals. It's a king that is the head pater of all the patria. So it's a very organic kind of scaling up. And to understand the psychology of that, or how that basically the fundamental unit of society is the oikos, or the family, the family estate. Really, it's not just like the nuclear family. It's more extensive than that, and how that is the central unit, and everything in classical civilization is built upon that. But what he also does, which is very interesting, another book I'm actually reading gets into this too. Maybe I'll point that out. What de Coulanges does is basically shows how at a certain point that system became too big to really succeed, when you started getting people who didn't fit into any of those family institutions, where you had the growth of mercantile economies rather than agrarian economies. You have cities that are just getting too big, where you have situations where people kind of fall out of the domestic religion, which actually happened, and you get all kinds of social strife that needs different institutions to come along and remedy those. So he kind of sees how private law was displaced by civic law, how people who were not affiliated in a oikos had to be like citizens, and that you had this new like way to wield power with legislation, which is completely new. So he gets in a lot into the breakdowns of that system and the rise of things like democracy, or the rule of the demos, or sort of degenerated aristocracies. And basically, he goes through the gamut to where you get to Plato and Aristotle, and you go, this is a complete like disaster. Yeah, Hellenic civilization is in a state of decay, where it almost needs like that strong man. It needed Pericles. It needed I don't like Solon, but it needed Pericles maybe. It needed Philip of Macedon and Alexander, and it needed Rome to become what it was, an imperium, because its really tight-knit organic structure was no longer working. So, but it's not a negative book. Like, this book is just it's just fantastic. There's not a page that is not underlined. So really great. Can't recommend it more highly. On top of that, I got into just a piece of classical literature that I like this way more than I thought I would, or I got more out of it than I thought I would. This is the founding epic of Rome, the Aeneid. So the story of Aeneas as the founder, and you'll actually understand what's going on if you read it in conjunction with De Collonges, because he talks a lot about the divine founder and how important founders are to a civilization. And that's what this epic is all about, is Aeneas founding Rome. So this was sort of a mental relief. Like, I just loved reading it, the poetry, and understanding sort of the mythology that undergirds the West. But it's not Hellenic. Like, this is Troy, Aeneas is a Trojan prince. So the Romans were kind of understanding their history as fitting into this larger Hellenic world, but not as Greeks. They weren't going to admit to be Greeks. No. So it kind of builds on top of that whole Indo-European picture of these are really daughter branches of one root, the same root that the Goths were a part of, that the Slavs were a part of, that the Iranians were a part of, that the Hittites were a part of. And that's what I really got out of this, is understanding like it's a cultural continuum, that the West is sort of all of these different peoples, but it kind of beats with the same heart. And I actually enjoyed this more than the Iliad and the Odyssey, to tell you the truth. I just thought it's a really beautiful mythology. So the next book that I actually got a lot out of is William Barrett's Irrational Man, a study of existential philosophy. And if you're looking for like a good primer to existentialism, this is your primer. So he starts all the way back in sort of, the anti-rationalists and the romantics, and then how that gave rise to existentialism as such. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Sartre. But he gives a really good critique of modernism. So, he's talking about irrationality, not because rationalism is bad, but because rationalism as sold by the rationalist Enlightenment is just an incomplete account of how human beings are. And he gives basically sort of a very Nietzschean account for how that breaks down and why we're in some of the intellectual and cultural problems we have, especially with nihilism, is because rationalism at the end of the day doesn't bring home the bacon, so to speak. So it's just a fantastic, a great critique of rationalist modernity and scientism that I thought was really worth reading. I didn't quite like his stuff on Nietzsche, because I don't think he really, he doesn't give Nietzsche, well, how do I put this? Okay, so Nietzsche is an interesting figure. So I obviously am very, very steeped in Nietzsche. I'm always reading Nietzsche. I always have the selected works, or thus Zarathustra or Twilight of the Idols. Like, I'm always like rereading Genealogy of Morals or something, because I think he gives such a profound description of how the Enlightenment project breaks down, how it kills God and takes humanity down with God. So there's aspects of Nietzsche that are really good, but there's also aspects of Nietzsche that I think are bad. So his descriptive aspects are fantastic, but most of his proscriptive aspects are like, what do we do about it? A lot of it I don't find very convincing. So there's like, Nietzsche's thought is really tightly, coordinated, but there are very obvious inconsistencies with his thought. Like man becoming a transcendent self-transcendence. like to become, so the doctrine of the Ubermensch, the doctrine of the Superman, like that because there is no more God, that we have to become something worth replacing God with, and how that's a self-defeating kind of project. Like you can't, there's no self-transcendence without a transcendent aim. It's the same critique like Dostoevsky kind of places on Nietzsche, even though it's not clear who was influencing who with the story of Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. But that's Raskolnikov's project, is to become a law unto himself. Um, and other philosophers critique Nietzsche for this. Julius Evola, coming from like a more perennialist tradition, basically says, no, without religion, without transcendence, like the Nietzschean project is dead on arrival. So there's some really profound contradictions in Nietzsche, even though his thought is very tightly integrated. There's just things that just don't work in it, which means that Nietzsche, his whole intellectual trajectory, I think, has split into two different camps. And one camp is sort of the neo-Marxist or the postmodern camp that keeps Nietzsche's critique of objective reality, but misses like some really important stuff in there. And one thing, this is actually a critique of Irrational Man. One thing that's part of Nietzsche's philosophy is the will to power. And Barrett argues that the neo-Marxist or Stalinists and neo-Marxist after Stalin, that they're sort of the inheritors of Nietzsche, because they perfectly express this will to power, especially the cultural Marxists like Gramsci, people like that. And I thought, no. You can't have the will to power without the doctrine of the Superman. Like you can't just will to be a law unto yourself unless you're a human being worthy of being a law unto yourself. Like, do you see how the two fit together? So you can't just say, this branch of thought is the successor of Nietzsche, even though it misses out on huge parts of the thought. The same goes with Foucault and Sartre, but particularly Foucault being sort of the heir to Nietzsche. I don't think so at all. Even Nietzsche's relativism is not relativism. Like it's perspectivalism. It's a perspective that's rooted in biology, in nature, in where the situation in life that you find yourself. It's not just feet floating in midair. So I don't know. There are people engaged in this project to really recover Nietzsche, to really bring certain ideas back from how they've been bastardized by postmodern thinkers and Marxist thinkers. So I think Barrett kind of gets that wrong. He gets Nietzsche wrong, I would say. So as much as I like this book, like again, there's highlights and underlines everywhere, all over it. I think because he's not really understanding Nietzsche and he sees sort of the cultural Marxists as the successor, that when he gives his own idea, his own project of what needs to happen in philosophy, it's kind of a flop. Like, to tell you the truth, I don't even know what he was talking about. Like I kept rereading that last chapter going, yeah, I don't get it. Because he recognizes what Nietzsche recognizes, like the problem of nihilism, the problem of not having transcendence, and he actually kind of does a Nietzschean sort of move of like, let's root back into psychology, let's kind of get in touch with this like vital tradition. But because he's basically a liberal, his vitalistic tradition can't have any particularity to it. Like it's this really I know convoluted is not the right word. It's tapping back into a root that he doesn't admit exists. So I could make heads or tails of what he actually thinks we should do, and I think Nietzsche actually gives a much better account of tapping back into what it means to be human, where he can't quite can't quite get there. So the book is fantastic. The conclusion, like a lot of the books I've been reading, is really lame, and I think it's because a lot of these authors have to kind of write from a standpoint of classical liberalism, so their conclusions have to echo that Enlightenment project, even though their work basically shows that it's a dead project. It's kind of a sad state that we've got ourselves in. But that's what I think. So finally, number 10, Thomas Carlyle. So Thomas Carlyle was a British, really an essayist and moralist and controversialist, but he did not disappoint. So I heard a lot of great things about Carlyle, and definitely did not disappoint. So he's the guy who basically came up with the whole concept of the hero, like, Joseph Campbell, probably could root his intellectual genealogy back to Carlyle. He wrote Heroes and Hero Worship and the Great Man Theory of History, wrote all kinds of historical works. But the work, I actually read a bunch of his works this year, but the one that I liked best was one he wrote for an anthropology kind of symposium or journal. And he wrote an essay called Characteristics, and it's just about anthropology. But it just blew me away. I was not prepared for how much I like this. And basically, what it is Nietzsche. All these different ideas in Nietzsche, like, rationality for the service of life, not for itself, like the critique of scholars who are, detached from a vital instinct, a critique of sort of this brainy kind of way of going about living life that's not really connected to instinct. So he hits all of those same notes, and I haven't come across any evidence that Carlyle influenced Nietzsche. I know Nietzsche was influenced by I'm forgetting his name, the American transcendentalist. The name escaped me, who's actually very similar to Carlyle, but I can't find any connection. But when you read, especially this, I mean, it reads as Nietzsche, but there's one really, really important difference, and that is Carlyle is a Christian. So you get all of those same kinds of ideas, like, character is born out of struggle, is similar to sort of Nietzschean's Heraclitean, war is the father of us all. Like I said, a critique of rationalism is really present. The whole idea that you need to become greater than what you are, but Carlyle roots it in an explicit transcendent, roots it in a Christian worldview, and which makes it great. Like it's really all of those, like I said, those key notes of Nietzschean philosophy, which I hold, which is really important to me, but gives it a theistic expression. And Carlyle is just a master of the English language, so it's just very beautiful. Anything by Carlyle is worth reading, but particularly this, I think is just really, it's really fantastic. So those are my 10 books for this year. If I can kind of bring it together in a thematic way, it really is just kind of fleshing out an anthropology, like what does it mean to be a human, which gets into politics. It also gets into worldview, in history and culture, all of those sorts of things. So I'm really glad that I got to explore some of these ideas this year. I don't know quite where I'm going next year. What I actually want to do is, because I've hit these things so hard, and like I said, I've studied this, almost as hard as I studied liturgy, or patristics. I'm thinking about the idea of kind of making it into some kind of doctoral program. It's just a matter of finding where that fits. And even if it doesn't work, it doesn't work out. But I'm definitely doing a lot of writing in this area of just understanding the roots of that culture that was Christianized. I think that's a worthwhile project. But it was a very fruitful year, and there's all kinds of like rabbit trails that I now want to follow. Like I'm currently reading, what are the sources of Roman civilizations, and reading a very good in-depth analysis that goes from like the Bronze Age to the Punic Wars. So early Roman history that I think is really tapping into that Indo-European sort of spirit, and also the same thing with Hellenic civilization. Another book on ancient Greece that goes from the from the Bronze Age to the Peloponnesian War. So pre-classical. Well, just right at the beginning of the classical Greek world with Heraclidian Athens. So again, I want to really tap into what is the source of the culture that I share, and kind of to share the Spenglerian sort of idea. Even though Spengler thinks we're a completely different civilization with the classical world, I think he's wrong on that. So I want to explore more of that, just understanding the real roots of the West, and also developing a theory of culture to kind of dovetail with the work I've already done on understanding evangelization, and how that is a cultural process just as much as it is an individual process. So that's what I hope to explore this coming year, and I already have a whole shelf full of books to go about doing that. But I really believe I covered a lot of important ground, just meaningful ground to me this year. So those are my 10 top books.